Hello, guys. Welcome to another bedtime scenario, thoughts you get before going to sleep. Before we begin this journey through an alternate timeline, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to us from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you lying in bed with the lights dimmed, or perhaps sitting in a quiet room as the day winds down? Wherever you are, whatever hour your clock shows, take a moment to settle in. Let your breathing slow. This is a space for wondering, for imagining, for letting your mind drift through the corridors of what might have been. Tonight, we explore a world that never witnessed one of the 20th century's most devastating conflicts. Imagine the year is 1937. The summer air hangs heavy over the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. In our world, on the night of July 7th, shots rang out in the darkness. Japanese and Chinese forces clashed. Within weeks, this small incident spiraled into a full-scale invasion that would consume China for 8 terrible years. But in the timeline we visit tonight, those shots were never fired. The tension that had been building simply dissipated. Diplomats found words where soldiers might have found weapons. Economic pressures that had been pushing Japan toward expansion found different outlets. The machinery of war that was being assembled piece by piece simply never engaged its gears. What changed? Perhaps a key military leader in Tokyo fell ill at a crucial moment, and the faction favoring southern expansion toward resource-rich Southeast Asia gained the upper hand instead. Perhaps a diplomatic mission that failed in our timeline succeeded in this one, finding compromise where there had been only demands. The exact mechanism of divergence matters less than its consequences. In this alternate 1937, the Japanese military presence in Manchuria, already established since 1931, remains contained. The Kwantung Army, that restless force that had acted with such independence from Tokyo, finds itself reined in by political forces back home. The Marco Polo Bridge remains just a bridge. Beijing continues its rhythms. Shanghai goes about its cosmopolitan business. And China, that ancient civilization wrestling with modernity, continues down a path that will be radically different from the one we know. Without the crucible of Japanese invasion, the internal struggles of China take on a completely different character. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces under Mao Zedong had been locked in civil war since the late 1920s. In our timeline, the Japanese invasion forced these bitter enemies into an uneasy alliance, a united front against the foreign invader. But in this alternate world, no such unifying threat appears. The Chinese Civil War, instead of being interrupted and transformed by Japanese aggression, continues its course. The nationalists, without the devastating losses inflicted by Japan, maintain stronger control over the urban and coastal regions. Their German-trained divisions are not destroyed in the defense of Shanghai. Their air force is not obliterated. Their treasury is not drained by years of total war. The industrial base that was destroyed or occupied by Japan in our world continues to develop under Chinese control. Meanwhile, the communist forces based in their strongholds in the northwest after the Long March find themselves without the opportunity that Japanese invasion provided. In our world, the communists gained immense legitimacy and popular support by positioning themselves as patriotic defenders against the Japanese. They expanded their base areas behind Japanese lines, recruited millions to their cause with the banner of national resistance, and emerged from the war as a powerful force that would eventually triumph in 1949. But without the Japanese invasion, this trajectory shifts. The communists remain a significant but more contained force, conducting guerrilla operations against the nationalists, but lacking the broader appeal that anti-Japanese resistance provided. The Chinese people, while perhaps sympathetic to communist ideals in some regions, do not rally to them as saviors of the nation from foreign conquest. The year 1937 passes into 1938, then 1939.
The world watches nervously as tensions rise in Europe. Germany under Hitler remilitarizes the Rhineland, annexes Austria, demands the Sudetenland. But in Asia, an uneasy peace holds. Japan, its military ambitions redirected, looks southward instead. The rubber plantations of Indochina, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, these become the focus of Japanese strategic planning. The decision-makers in Tokyo calculate that resources can be obtained through diplomacy, economic pressure, and, if necessary, action against European colonial holdings weakened by war in Europe, rather than the quagmire of occupying vast stretches of China. This recalculation, this slight shift in the geopolitical compass sends ripples through time that will reshape the entire century.
As the 1930s close and the 1940s dawn, China presents a study in contrasts, but also in continuity. The nationalist government, headquartered in Nanjing, continues its program of modernization that in our timeline was brutally interrupted. The decade of Nanjing government from 1927 to 1937 had seen significant progress in infrastructure, industry, and education. Railways expanded, modern banks operated, universities trained a new generation of engineers, doctors, and administrators. Currency stabilized under the reforms of Finance Minister H. Kung. Factories, modeled on Western and Japanese examples, produced textiles, light machinery, and consumer goods. This development trajectory, cut short by Japanese bombs and occupation in our world, continues uninterrupted in this alternate timeline. Picture the factories of Shanghai and Wuhan continuing their operations. The machinery imported from Germany and the United States keeps running, keeps producing. Chinese engineers gain experience. Chinese workers develop skills. Chinese entrepreneurs build business networks. The foreign concessions in Shanghai, those peculiar zones of international control, continue their role as conduits for capital and technology. Chinese students still travel abroad for education, particularly to America and Europe, but also return home to find opportunities in a country that, while torn by internal strife, is not devastated by foreign occupation. The brain drain that accompanies any invasion never occurs. Talent stays in China or returns to China, creating an accumulation of human capital that will pay dividends in the decades to come. The nationalist government, for all its flaws and corruption, maintains its focus on building a modern state. The military, trained by German advisors until the outbreak of war in Europe cuts off that relationship, remains relatively intact. Instead of losing millions of men in futile defenses against Japanese advances, the nationalist army fights a lower-intensity civil war against communist forces. Casualties are still significant, hardship is still real, but the existential crisis of foreign invasion is absent. The Air Force that was wiped out in the early days of Japanese bombing campaigns in our world continues to exist, trains new pilots, acquires new aircraft. The Navy, small but present, patrols China's long coastline. These military forces, while engaged in internal conflict, are not shattered by years of total war. Economically, the picture is complex but more hopeful than in our world. The Chinese economy of the 1930s, while experiencing growth in certain sectors, faced tremendous challenges. Rural poverty was endemic, warlord depredations had taken their toll, and the global depression had rippled through China's export-oriented coastal regions. But without the destruction wrought by Japanese invasion, without the occupation of the richest provinces, without the hyperinflation that war spending brought in our timeline, the Chinese economy maintains a fragile stability. Farmers in the countryside continue their age-old rhythms, untouched by the scorched earth campaigns that characterized the Japanese occupation. The textile mills of Shanghai keep their spindles turning. The coal mines of Shanxi continue operating under Chinese ownership rather than being seized for the Japanese war machine. Trade relationships with the Western powers, strained but functional, channeled goods in and out of Chinese ports. Culturally, this alternate China experiences a continuation of the vibrant ferment that characterized the 1920s and 30s. The May 4th movement had ushered in an era of intellectual exploration, questioning traditional Confucian values, embracing new ideas from abroad, debating the path China should take into modernity. Writers like Lu Xun, though he died in 1936, in both timelines, left a legacy that continued to influence Chinese literature. In our world, Japanese occupation created a cultural desert in many regions, with intellectuals fleeing, universities closing, and creative expression stifled. But in this alternate timeline, Chinese universities continue operating, students continue studying, writers continue writing. The great debates about China's future, about tradition and modernity, about nationalism and internationalism continue in the pages of journals and in lecture halls from universities from Beijing to Chongqing. The cities pulse with life. Shanghai, that most cosmopolitan of Chinese cities, continues its role as the Paris of the East. Jazz plays in nightclubs. Foreign diplomats mingle with Chinese businessmen. Refugees from Europe fleeing Hitler find sanctuary in the international settlements as they did in our world. The city's newspapers publish in multiple languages, carrying news from around the world. Street vendors sell their wares. Rickshaws navigate crowded streets. The blend of East and West, of ancient and modern, continues to evolve in a city that is not yet scarred by Japanese military occupation, not yet subjected to the harsh controls and privations that war brought in our reality.
When war erupts in Europe in September 1939, Asia watches from a different position than in our timeline. Germany's invasion of Poland sets off the catastrophic chain of events that will engulf the world, but the Asian theater of this global conflict takes a fundamentally different shape. Japan, without being bogged down in a protracted war in China, faces different strategic calculations. The militarists in Tokyo, still ambitious, still hungry for resources to fuel their industrial economy, still convinced of Japan's destiny to lead a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, look toward the colonial possessions of European powers. France falls to Germany in June 1940, just as in our timeline. The French colonial authorities in Indochina suddenly find themselves cut off from the mother country, vulnerable and isolated. Japan, seeing opportunity, applies pressure. By late 1940, Japanese forces move into northern Indochina with minimal resistance. The Vichy French authorities, powerless to resist, acquiesce. This provides Japan with the rubber and rice it desperately needs and positions forces for further southern expansion. The Dutch East Indies, with its oil fields, becomes the next target. The British colonies of Malaya and Burma loom in Japanese strategic planning. All of these moves occur earlier in this timeline than in our history because Japan is not expending blood and treasure in the endless campaigns across China. The United States watches these developments with growing concern. American policymakers, led by President Roosevelt, view Japanese expansion with alarm. Oil embargoes are implemented. Diplomatic negotiations attempt to restrain Japanese ambitions. The tensions that led to Pearl Harbor in our timeline still build in this alternate world, perhaps even more intensely because Japan, not exhausted by years of China fighting, appears stronger and more aggressive in its southern advance. The calculations in Tokyo become stark. American economic pressure threatens to strangle Japan's war machine. The choice, as Japanese military planners see it, is between accepting American terms and abandoning their imperial ambitions, or striking first to secure the resources of Southeast Asia before American power can be brought to bear. December 7, 1941 might still dawn with surprise attacks, but the strategic situation is different. Japan, having conserved military resources by not fighting in China, possesses a more powerful navy, a larger air force, more experienced troops ready for deployment southward. The attack on Pearl Harbor, if it occurs in this timeline, is potentially more devastating. The simultaneous assaults on the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies proceed with forces that are not divided between the China theater and the southern operations. The Japanese military juggernaut focused entirely on the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia, and the elimination of American naval power in the Pacific achieves its initial objectives with perhaps even greater success than in our timeline. But there is a critical difference. China, while torn by civil war, is not an active battlefield against Japan. The nationalist government maintains its sovereignty. Chinese resources are not being drained by Japanese occupation. Chinese manpower is not being slaughtered in massive anti-Japanese campaigns. When the United States enters the war and begins building the Grand Alliance against the Axis powers, China's role is fundamentally different. Instead of being a major theater of operations, a vast land where millions of Japanese troops are tied down, China is a potential ally or neutral party. American strategists planning the Pacific Campaign do not envision using China as a base for air operations against Japan. The famous Doolittle raid, which in our timeline launched from carriers but planned to land in China, takes a different form, or perhaps does not occur at all. The Chinese Civil War continues even as World War rages elsewhere. The nationalists and communists, without the unifying threat of Japanese invasion, maintain their hostilities. Some Chinese leaders see opportunity in the global conflict. Perhaps there are those who advocate aligning with the Allies, offering bases or resources in exchange for American aid and recognition. Perhaps others counsel neutrality, focusing on internal affairs and avoiding entanglement in the wider war. The communists, always opportunistic, might see the global conflict as a chance to expand their influence, to position themselves as the true patriotic force, even without the vehicle of anti-Japanese resistance. The interplay of these forces creates a Chinese political landscape that is complex and unpredictable, but distinctly different from the one we know.
The Pacific War that unfolds in this alternate timeline reshapes the global conflict in profound ways. In our history, the China theater tied down over 1 million Japanese troops, consumed vast quantities of supplies and ammunition, and drained Japan's economy for years even before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese army fought endless campaigns across China's vast interior, from the humid south to the dusty north, from the coastal cities to the mountain strongholds. These operations, while giving Japan control of major cities and railway lines, never truly pacified the countryside. Guerrilla resistance, both communist and nationalist, harassed Japanese forces constantly. The occupation required enormous garrisons. The attempt to exploit China's resources for the war effort was only partially successful. In essence, China became a bleeding wound for the Japanese war machine, weakening it for the larger conflict with the United States. In this alternate timeline, Japan enters the Pacific War without that drain. The Japanese military, while still facing the industrial might of the United States, does so with resources that were not expended in China. The veterans of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, instead of being scattered across China in occupation duties, are available for deployment against American forces. The aircraft that were lost in the skies over Chongqing and Chengdu in our timeline remain in the Japanese arsenal. The ships that were used to supply garrisons on China's coast are free for operations in the Pacific. This creates a Japanese war machine that, in the early years of the war, is significantly more formidable than in our history. American planners, as they develop their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, face a different strategic calculation. In our timeline, one of the key American objectives was to establish air bases in China from which to bomb the Japanese home islands. The China-Burma-India theater, while often a lower priority than the Pacific operations, absorbed significant resources and involved complex logistics, famously including the aerial supply route over the Himalayas known as the Hump. American officers like General Stilwell worked with Chinese forces, training them, equipping them, and attempting to create an effective fighting force. These efforts, while ultimately contributing to the defeat of Japan, were fraught with difficulty and frustration. In this alternate world, the China theater as we knew it simply does not exist. American strategy focuses entirely on the naval and amphibious campaign across the Pacific Islands. This concentration of force cuts both ways. American planners can dedicate resources that would have gone to China toward the Pacific campaign, potentially accelerating the advance across the Pacific. The massive amount of supplies that were flown over the Hump or shipped to Chinese ports in our timeline are instead available for operations at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and the other bloody island battles. American industrial production, already prodigious, channels its output more efficiently toward the direct confrontation with Japan. However, the Japanese forces that would have been tied down in China are now available to defend the island bastions more heavily. The battles at each stepping stone toward Japan, already fierce in our timeline, become even more intense as Japan commits forces that in our world was scattered across China. The air war takes a different shape as well. In our history, the 14th Air Force under Claire Chennault operated from bases in China, attacking Japanese shipping, bombing occupied cities, and supporting Chinese ground forces. The famous Flying Tigers had fought in China's skies even before America's official entry into the war. These air operations, while not decisive in themselves, were part of the broader pressure on Japan. In this alternate timeline, the air war against Japan is conducted entirely from carriers and from captured island bases. The B-29 Super Fortress bombers, which in our timeline operated from bases in China before moving to the Mariana Islands, begin their campaign against Japanese industry only from island bases. This might delay the strategic bombing campaign by months, or it might prompt earlier capture of islands close enough to Japan for bomber operations. The question of how the war ends becomes more complex in this scenario. In our timeline, Japan faced enemies on multiple fronts, its forces stretched impossibly thin, its economy collapsing under the weight of total war, and still it required the shock of atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war to finally surrender. In this alternate timeline, Japan is fighting primarily against the United States across the Pacific. It is stronger in some ways, having conserved resources and manpower, but it also faces the undivided attention of American military might. The calculus of when and how Japan might be defeated shifts, creating possibilities both for a quicker end to the war if American force is concentrated more effectively, or a longer war if Japanese defenses are stronger without the China drain.
As the Second World War reaches its climax in the Pacific, with American forces advancing island by island toward the Japanese homeland, China remains locked in its internal struggle. The Chinese Civil War, which in our timeline was interrupted by Japanese invasion and resumed after Japan's defeat, follows a continuous trajectory in this alternate world. The years from 1937 to 1945, instead of being dominated by resistance against Japan, see the ongoing contest between nationalist and communist forces for control of China's future. This extended period of civil conflict, without the interruption and transformation that Japanese invasion brought, fundamentally alters the balance of power and the nature of the struggle.
The nationalist government maintains its hold on the major cities and the most economically productive regions. Nanjing remains the capital, its government ministries functioning, its bureaucrats administering, its police maintaining order. The coastal provinces, from Guangdong in the south through Shanghai and up to the north, remain under nationalist control. The Yangtze River Valley, that crucial artery of commerce and communication, is governed from Nanjing. This territorial control translates into economic resources. The nationalists collect taxes from China's most prosperous regions. They control the customs revenues from the ports. They maintain relationships with foreign powers, particularly the United States, which sees the nationalist government as the legitimate authority in China and provides limited diplomatic and economic support, even before Pearl Harbor brings America into the war. The military balance also favors the nationalists in this timeline. Without the devastating losses inflicted by Japanese forces, the nationalist army remains a more coherent fighting force. The divisions trained by German advisors, the artillery units, the small but functional air force all survive intact. Officers gain experience in campaigns against communist forces rather than being killed in futile defensive battles against overwhelming Japanese firepower. The army, while engaged in continuous low-intensity conflict, is not broken and demoralized as it was by years of retreating before the Japanese advance. This creates a nationalist military that is more confident, more capable, and more likely to achieve success against communist guerrillas. The communist forces, meanwhile, face a much more difficult situation than they did in our timeline. Their strategy had been shaped by the opportunities that Japanese invasion provided. In our world, they expanded from their base areas, recruited extensively among the peasantry using the appeal of anti-Japanese resistance, and built a powerful movement that controlled vast areas of the countryside by war's end. But in this alternate timeline, they lack that galvanizing cause. Peasant grievances against landlords, the appeal of communist land reform, and anger at nationalist corruption still provide fuel for recruitment. But without the mantle of patriotic resistance against a foreign invader, the communists struggle to expand beyond their traditional strongholds in the Northwest and in scattered base areas in the countryside. Mao Zedong and the communist leadership adapt their strategy to this reality. They continue to emphasize guerrilla warfare, winning over the peasantry through land reform and more equitable policies in areas they control. They conduct raids against nationalist forces, ambushing supply columns, attacking isolated garrisons, and melting back into the countryside. But these operations, while annoying to the nationalists, do not threaten the government's core control over major cities and economically vital regions. The communists remain a persistent but contained challenge, much like various rebel movements throughout Chinese history that controlled peripheral areas but never succeeded in overthrowing the central government. The international dimension of the Chinese Civil War also differs in this timeline. In our history, the Soviet Union provided significant support to the Chinese Communists, especially after the defeat of Japan, when Soviet forces occupied Manchuria and handed over Japanese weapons to Communist troops. But in this alternate world, without Japanese occupation of Manchuria and without the Soviet invasion that followed Japan's collapse, the Soviets have less opportunity to directly aid the Chinese Communists. Stalin, always calculating and cautious, maintains formal relations with the nationalist government while providing covert support to the communists. This support is limited by practical considerations of distance and access. Soviet advisors might filter into communist-controlled areas, and some weapons and supplies might reach the communists through long and difficult routes. But the massive transfer of arms that occurred in Manchuria in our timeline does not happen. By the mid-1940s, as the Second World War approaches its end, China presents a picture of a divided nation, but one where the division is managed rather than catastrophic. The nationalists govern the cities and the modern sector of the economy. The communists control scattered rural base areas and wage guerrilla war. Neither side has achieved complete victory, but neither has suffered total defeat. This stalemate, while frustrating to leaders on both sides, creates a kind of stability born of exhaustion and balance of forces. The question hanging over China as the global war ends is whether this situation will continue, whether one side will gain decisive advantage, or whether some form of political settlement might be negotiated.
When the atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, or perhaps when Japan surrenders after the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, or possibly when American invasion of the home islands becomes imminent, the ending of the Pacific War reverberates across Asia in ways both similar to and different from our timeline. Japan, defeated and occupied by American forces, begins its transformation into a democratic nation and American ally. But the landscape of East Asia into which this defeated Japan emerges is fundamentally altered by the absence of the China theater during the war. The American occupation of Japan proceeds much as it did in our history. General Douglas MacArthur arrives in Tokyo as supreme commander for the Allied powers. The Japanese emperor renounces his divinity. A new constitution is drafted, enshrining democratic principles and renouncing war. War crimes trials prosecute leaders responsible for aggression and atrocities. The Japanese economy, shattered by strategic bombing and the destruction of its military-industrial complex, begins the long process of reconstruction with American assistance. The Korean peninsula, occupied by Soviet forces in the north and American forces in the south, is divided along the 38th parallel, setting the stage for future tragedy. All of these developments mirror our timeline because they flow from the Pacific War itself, not from the China theater. But China emerges from the war in a completely different position. It was not occupied by Japan. Its people did not suffer the massacres, the comfort women system, the forced labor, the starvation, and the other horrors of Japanese occupation that killed tens of millions in our timeline. Chinese cities were not bombed into rubble. The industrial base, while limited, was not destroyed. The transportation network, while damaged by years of civil war, was not systematically wrecked by Japanese occupation and Allied bombing. Most importantly, the Chinese people did not experience the crucible of 8 years of resistance against a brutal occupier. The shared suffering that in our timeline helped legitimize the communist movement and eventually brought it to power. The nationalist government, still led by Chiang Kai-shek, claims its seat as one of the victors of the Second World War. China, as in our timeline, is granted a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, one of the 5 major powers with veto authority. This recognition reflects China's size, population, and strategic importance, rather than its direct contribution to the defeat of Japan, which, in this timeline, was minimal. American policymakers looking toward the post-war order in Asia see the nationalist government as a crucial ally in the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. Aid flows to China, not the massive military assistance required to defeat Japan, but economic and technical support designed to strengthen a friendly government and counter communist influence. The Chinese Civil War, which in our timeline resumed immediately after Japan's defeat and quickly escalated into full-scale conflict, continues its pattern of the previous years. The nationalists, strengthened by American support and not weakened by years of fighting Japan, maintain control over the major population and economic centers. The communists, without the weapons they captured from Japanese forces in Manchuria in our timeline, and without the popular legitimacy gained from leading resistance against Japan, find themselves in a weaker position than they occupied in 1945 in our history.
Negotiations for a political settlement occur periodically, mediated sometimes by American diplomats, but fundamental disagreements over the structure of government and control of military forces prevent any lasting agreement. The broader Asian context influences these developments. The European colonial powers, weakened by war, face independence movements in their Asian colonies. Britain begins the process of decolonization in India and Burma. France attempts to reassert control over Indochina and finds itself facing determined Vietnamese resistance. The Netherlands faces Indonesian independence movements. The United States grants independence to the Philippines in 1946, as previously promised. These waves of decolonization create both opportunities and challenges for China. The nationalist government positions itself as a leader of Asian nations emerging from colonialism, advocating for self-determination and equality in international affairs. This stance wins China friends among the newly independent nations and enhances its prestige, though its ongoing civil conflict limits its ability to project power or provide the kind of leadership it aspires to. The emergence of the Cold War shapes Asian dynamics profoundly. The Soviet Union, having defeated Nazi Germany, turns its attention to consolidating control over Eastern Europe and expanding communist influence globally. Stalin views Asia as an important theater in the ideological and geopolitical struggle with the West. Support for communist movements in China, Korea, Indochina, and elsewhere becomes a key element of Soviet policy. The United States, adopting the doctrine of containment, seeks to prevent further communist expansion. The nationalist government in China becomes a frontline state in this contest, receiving American support as a bulwark against communism, even as it continues to struggle with internal communist insurgency.
The years following the Second World War see China embarking on an economic development path that is uniquely its own, shaped by the absence of Japanese occupation and the continuation of nationalist governance over the core regions of the country. The economic situation is complex, marked by both opportunities and severe challenges. The nationalist government, having maintained control over the cities and the modern economic sectors throughout the war years, inherits an industrial base that, while limited, is not destroyed. The factories of Shanghai continue operating. The mines of Shanxi keep producing coal. The railway network, damaged by years of conflict but not obliterated, connects major cities. This foundation, modest by the standards of developed nations but significant compared to the devastation of our timeline, provides the starting point for post-war development. American economic assistance flows into China as part of the broader American strategy of strengthening allies in the Cold War. Technical advisors arrive to help with infrastructure projects. Loans are extended for the purchase of machinery and equipment. American firms, seeing opportunity in China's vast market and resource base, establish joint ventures with Chinese partners. The textile industry, long a strength of Chinese manufacturing, expands with imported machinery. Light industries producing consumer goods, from bicycles to basic electronics, begin to develop. The agricultural sector, while still dominated by traditional methods and suffering from inequitable land tenure systems, benefits from some introduction of improved seeds and techniques. This American engagement with China's economy, more extensive than in our timeline because China is viewed as a key ally rather than a country torn apart by civil war, accelerates certain aspects of development. However, profound problems continue to plague the Chinese economy. Inflation, a persistent issue, is managed better than in our timeline because the government is not spending vast sums on all-out civil war, but monetary stability remains elusive. Corruption, endemic in the nationalist administration, siphons resources and undermines efficiency. Rural poverty, the condition of the vast majority of Chinese people, remains largely unaddressed.
The land reform that in our timeline the communists implemented with brutal thoroughness does not occur under nationalist rule. Landlords continue to extract heavy rents from tenant farmers. Rural indebtedness traps peasants in cycles of poverty. This failure to address the rural crisis limits the potential for economic development and provides ongoing fuel for communist recruitment in the countryside. The urban economy develops unevenly. Shanghai and other coastal cities, always the most modern and cosmopolitan parts of China, grow and prosper. A middle class of merchants, professionals, and skilled workers expands. Universities train engineers and scientists. A consumer culture, influenced by American products and media, begins to root take among the urban elite. The cities feature Western-style department stores, cinemas showing Hollywood films, restaurants serving both Chinese and foreign cuisine, and vibrant press publishing newspapers and magazines. This urban modernity creates a stark contrast with the rural hinterland where life continues much as it has for centuries. The gap between city and countryside, always present in Chinese history, widens in this period. Industrial development follows a pattern influenced by both internal conditions and external relationships. The nationalist government, pragmatic rather than ideological in economic matters, encourages private enterprise while maintaining state control over strategic sectors. Major industries like steel production, armaments, and railways remain under government ownership or close government supervision. Other sectors welcome private capital. Both domestic and foreign, once relations normalize, invest in Chinese ventures, seeking access to the large domestic market and China's relatively inexpensive labor. Technology transfer becomes a key element of China's development strategy. Chinese students continue to study abroad, particularly in the United States, learning engineering, science, business, and other fields crucial for modernization. Many return home bringing knowledge and skills that are applied in Chinese contexts. The government establishes research institutes and technical colleges to build domestic capacity. Foreign companies that invest in China are often required to share technology and train Chinese workers and managers. This process, slow and sometimes frustrating, gradually builds the human capital and technical knowledge that are essential for sustained economic growth. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, China begins to show signs of becoming a significant economic power in Asia, though it remains far behind Japan or the Western nations in overall development.
The political landscape of China in this alternate timeline evolves in ways that reflect both continuity with the Republican era and adaptation to the pressures of the post-war world. The nationalist government, having survived the challenges of civil war without the catastrophic defeat it suffered in our timeline, maintains its authority over the major population centers and economically developed regions. Chiang Kai-shek remains at the apex of power, but the nature of his rule and the structure of the government beneath him are shaped by different circumstances than in our history. The regime is authoritarian, with power concentrated in Chiang's hands and in the Kuomintang party apparatus, but it also must navigate a more complex political environment than the one-party state that emerged in mainland China under communist rule in our timeline. The Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, continues as the dominant political force. Its ideology, Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people, nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood, provides the rhetorical framework for government policy. However, the actual implementation of these principles is uneven. Nationalism is strongly emphasized, with the government promoting Chinese cultural identity and sovereignty against both Western imperialism and communist ideology. Democracy is promised but perpetually deferred, with Chiang justifying authoritarian rule as necessary during the ongoing struggle against communist insurgency. people's livelihood, the social and economic welfare dimension of Sun's philosophy, receives attention in government programs but is hampered by corruption and limited resources. The gap between the party's ideals and the reality of governance creates disillusionment among intellectuals and reformers. Within the nationalist government, different factions compete for influence and resources. Military leaders, controlling armies loyal to them personally, wield significant power. Regional administrators govern provinces with considerable autonomy, sometimes cooperating with the central government and sometimes pursuing their own interests. The party bureaucracy, centered in Nanjing, attempts to extend central control, but faces resistance from these entrenched local power structures. This factionalism, a persistent feature of nationalist politics, creates a government that is often inefficient and divided, but also somewhat pluralistic, with different centers of power checking each other. Chiang must constantly maneuver among these factions, using a combination of patronage, threats, and pragmatic compromise to maintain his position. The intellectual and cultural sphere, while subject to government censorship and control, retains more vitality and diversity than in the totalitarian system that emerged under communism in our timeline. Universities operate with a degree of autonomy. Professors debate ideas, students organize, and intellectuals publish critiques of government policy within certain boundaries. The press, while subject to censorship on sensitive political topics, covers news and expresses a range of opinions. This limited space for civil society allows for ongoing dialogue about China's future. Liberal intellectuals advocate for genuine democratic reforms. Traditionalists call for the revival of Confucian values. Technocrats focus on economic development. This ferment, constrained but real, creates a political culture more diverse than either the communist dictatorship of our timeline or the rigid authoritarianism of other regimes. The communist challenge persists, but in a contained form. The Communist Party, operating from base areas in remote regions, continues to recruit among the peasantry and wage guerrilla warfare against nationalist forces. However, without the momentum and resources they gained from anti-Japanese resistance and from Soviet support in Manchuria, the Communists remain a chronic irritant rather than an existential threat. The nationalist military, better equipped and trained than in our timeline, conducts periodic campaigns to suppress communist strongholds. These operations achieve mixed results, sometimes clearing areas of communist presence, but unable to permanently pacify the countryside or address the underlying grievances that fuel recruitment. A stalemate develops, with the communists controlling peripheral rural areas and the nationalists dominating cities and transportation routes. As the 1940s give way to the 1950s, pressure builds for political reform. Urban middle classes, benefiting from economic growth, demand more participation in governance. Intellectuals call for freedom of speech and assembly. Regional leaders chafe under central control. International allies, particularly the United States, encourage democratization as part of the broader Cold War narrative of free world versus communist tyranny. Chiang, aging and facing these pressures, must decide whether to liberalize the political system or tighten control. Different scenarios are possible. Perhaps gradual reforms occur, allowing limited local elections and easing press censorship. Perhaps Chiang resists change, provoking unrest and political crisis. Perhaps a succession crisis after Chiang's eventual death creates opportunities for transformation. The political future is uncertain, but filled with possibilities that differ dramatically from the communist totalitarianism of our timeline.
As the Cold War solidifies into the defining feature of international relations in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, China finds itself positioned very differently than in our timeline. Instead of becoming a communist nation allied with the Soviet Union and engaged in confrontation with the West, this
alternate China remains under nationalist governance and aligned with the American-led Free World Bloc. This alignment fundamentally reshapes Cold War dynamics in Asia and has global implications. The People's Republic of China, which in our timeline was proclaimed by Mao Zedong in October 1949 and immediately became a major factor in world affairs, does not exist in this alternate history. Instead, the Republic of China continues as the sole government claiming sovereignty over the Chinese nation. The Korean War, that first hot conflict of the Cold War, takes a dramatically different course if it occurs at all in this timeline. In our history, North Korea's invasion of South Korea in June 1950 was supported by Stalin and eventually brought massive Chinese intervention after UN forces approached Chinese border. The Chinese intervention, motivated by security concerns about American forces on their frontier and by ideological solidarity with fellow communists, resulted in a bloody stalemate that still defines the Korean Peninsula today. In this alternate timeline, with China under nationalist rule and aligned with the United States, Chinese intervention on behalf of North Korea is highly unlikely. If North Korea still invades the South, backed by Soviet support, the UN response, led by American forces, would not face Chinese opposition. The outcome might be very different, potentially leading to the unification of Korea under a non-communist government. Alternatively, awareness of likely Chinese non-intervention or even potential support for the South might deter North Korea from invading in the first place, leaving Korea divided but without the devastating war. American strategic thinking about Asia in this timeline revolves around China in this timeline, much that revolved around Japan in our history. The United States, having secured Japan as an ally through the occupation and Reconstruction, sees China as another key partner in containing Soviet influence in Asia. Military assistance to the nationalist government helps modernize the Chinese armed forces. American advisors train Chinese troops. American weapons, from rifles to aircraft, flow to China. Joint military planning occurs, with scenarios developed for potential conflict with the Soviet Union. Naval cooperation begins, with Chinese ports available to American ships and potentially joint patrols in Asian waters. This security partnership makes China a central component of the American alliance system in Asia, alongside Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. Economically, American engagement with China is extensive. The Marshall Plan in Europe demonstrated the effectiveness of economic aid in rebuilding war-damaged economies and creating prosperous allies. While China was not as devastated as Europe, it still needs development assistance. American aid programs, technical assistance, and private investment help modernize Chinese infrastructure and industry. American companies see China as a vast market and a source of inexpensive labor, much as they would later view China after its opening in the late 20th century in our timeline. Trade between the United States and China grows, with China exporting textiles and light manufactured goods while importing machinery, technology, and grain. This economic interdependence creates powerful constituencies in both countries, favoring continued cooperation. Within the communist bloc, the absence of communist China as an ally is a significant loss for the Soviet Union. Stalin and later Soviet leaders must confront American power in Asia without the support of the world's most populous nation. The Sino-Soviet alliance that formed in our timeline and provided mutual support despite growing tensions does not exist. The Soviet Union must rely on smaller allies like North Korea and North Vietnam if that conflict develops, without the depth of Chinese manpower and resources. This alters the balance of power in Asia decidedly in favor of the West. Soviet ambitions in Asia are more constrained. The global ideological struggle between communism and capitalism lacks one of its major players on the communist side, potentially affecting the confidence and momentum of communist movements worldwide.
China's relationship with the developing world also differs from our timeline. In our history, communist China became a voice for the Third World, the newly independent nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that sought to chart a course independent of both the American and Soviet blocs. China under Mao positioned itself as the leader of poor nations struggling against imperialism and colonialism. The Bandung Conference of 1955, where China played a prominent role, symbolized this effort. In this alternate timeline, nationalist China still participates in Third World forums and advocates for Asian interests, but without the anti-American and revolutionary rhetoric that characterized Communist China's approach. China promotes development and sovereignty while maintaining its alliance with the United States. This creates a different model for developing nations, one that suggests economic development and partnership with the West are compatible with maintaining cultural identity and national independence.
As we reach the end of this journey through an alternate history, it is time to pause and reflect on what this exploration reveals about history, contingency, and the forces that shape nations and civilizations. The world we have imagined tonight, where China was never invaded by Japan, diverges from our reality in profound ways. Yet it also helps us understand what actually happened by showing us what might have been different. History is not predetermined, not a single track laid out inevitably from past to future. It is shaped by decisions, by accidents, by the interplay of human choices and impersonal forces. The shooting that did not happen at Marco Polo Bridge in our imagined timeline, the diplomatic success that did not occur in our reality, reminds us how seemingly small events can cascade into world historical transformations. Think about the millions of lives that were different in this alternate world. The people who died in the Nanjing massacre, the comfort women enslaved by the Japanese military, the civilians killed in bombing raids, the soldiers who perished in countless battles across China. All those who suffered unimaginable horrors in our timeline lived different lives in this imagined world. They experienced different hardships, certainly, for China was still torn by civil conflict and poverty, but they were spared the specific horrors of Japanese occupation. Their individual stories, multiplied by millions, create a vastly different collective experience for the Chinese nation. The trauma that shaped Chinese historical memory and Chinese attitudes toward Japan in our world does not exist in the same form in this alternate timeline. The relationship between China and Japan, always complex, takes a different path when not scarred by the events of 1937 to 1945. Consider also the global implications of this alternate history. The Second World War, while still a catastrophic global conflict, is fought without the China theater that consumed so many resources and lives. The Cold War emerges in a world where China is aligned with the West rather than the communist bloc, fundamentally altering the balance of power and the possibilities for both conflict and cooperation. The developing nations of Asia and beyond see a different model in China, one that suggests various paths to modernity and development rather than the stark binary of our timeline. The economic development of Asia in the late 20th century, which in our world was initially led by Japan and later by China after its reform and opening, might have followed a different trajectory, with China playing an earlier and different role. Yet we must also acknowledge what this thought experiment cannot tell us. History is too complex, too contingent on countless individual decisions at random events for any alternate scenario to be confidently predicted beyond a certain point. We can imagine plausible ways the world might have been different if Japan had not invaded China, but we cannot know with certainty what would have transpired. Perhaps the nationalists would have eventually defeated the communists and built prosperous democratic China.
Perhaps the Civil War would have dragged on for decades in a destructive stalemate. Perhaps some other crisis or opportunity would have reshaped China's trajectory in ways we cannot foresee. The future is always uncertain, shaped by choices not yet made and events not yet occurred. What we can say with more confidence is that the absence of Japanese invasion would have mattered profoundly. The experience of resistance against foreign conquest, the destruction and suffering of 8 years of war, the opportunities and challenges created by that conflict, all shaped the China that emerged after 1945 in our timeline. Without that crucible, China would have been different. And with China different, Asia and the world would have been different. Understanding this helps us appreciate how historically contingent the world we inhabit truly is. The geopolitical map we take for granted, the alliances and enmities that seem natural, the economic relationships that structure global commerce, all of these emerged from specific historical events that might have unfolded differently. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps let your mind wander through the implications of this alternate world we have explored. Imagine the cities that were never burned, the lives that were never lost, the opportunities that opened or closed because history turned at a different angle. Think about how individual choices and impersonal forces interact to create the flow of history. Reflect on the resilience of human beings and societies, how they respond to different challenges and create different futures from different starting points. And consider how the world you know, for all its problems and conflicts, is just one possible outcome of a past that was never inevitable, a present that might have been otherwise, and a future that remains unwritten. The alternate China we visited tonight, developing under nationalist governance, maintaining ties with the West, experiencing gradual modernization without the revolutionary upheaval of our timeline, is neither utopian nor dystopian. It is simply different, with its own challenges, tragedies, and triumphs. The people living in that alternate world, if they could somehow be asked, might envy certain aspects of our timeline while being grateful to have been spared others. Such is the nature of historical contingency. There are no perfect paths, only different journeys with different destinations. As you close your eyes and let consciousness fade, know that the exploration of alternate histories is not mere fantasy or entertainment, though it can be both of those things. It is a way of understanding more deeply the world we actually inhabit, by seeing it against the background of worlds that might have been. It cultivates humility about our knowledge, awareness of contingency and possibility, and appreciation for the complex interplay of forces that shape human affairs. The China of our reality, with its century of humiliation followed by revolutionary transformation and dramatic rise to global power, is an epic story. The China we imagined tonight, taking a different path through the 20th century, would have been equally epic in different ways. Both are worthy of contemplation as we seek to understand the human experience across time and possibility. Sleep now and dream of the paths history takes and the paths it might have taken. Dream of the Marco Polo Bridge in summer twilight, of shots not fired and wars not fought. Dream of cities continuing with a list of lives lived differently, of a world shaped by the presence or absence of specific choices in specific moments. And when you wake, you will return to this timeline, this world, with perhaps a deeper appreciation for the contingency and possibility that surrounds us always. Good night.